bad oversight because I've just got a lot of books that I've been looking at lately that I read his book a while back, so these are fresher in my mind. But yeah, go pick up Steve Christie's book on the canon. All right. Let's see. It says Nate, member for 12 months. Hey, congrats, Nate. It says, is Jesus the Messiah, son of Joseph, descending from both Joseph and Judah, or is the idea of a Messiah ben Joseph baseless? I would not say it's baseless. How we get there and what that means is the million-dollar question. At some point, I may do something on this. If you're possibly familiar with David Mitchell. David Mitchell is a guy who's spoken to this a lot, and it's a large topic, but let me just say a couple of things about it. Now, we know that in Jewish thought, they came up with the notion of a Messiah ben David and a Messiah ben Joseph. So a Messiah who's descended from David, a Messiah who's descended from Joseph. Now, we object to the idea that there are two Messiahs, so usually people just dismiss this whole notion of a Messiah ben Joseph. But what if there's a way of affirming both, right? What's interesting is when you look at Scripture, the evidence for thinking of a Messiah descending from Joseph is there, and that same evidence, though, in many cases points to him as a Davidic Messiah, which is what's really interesting. So I give you an example. So think in the I'm going to back into this a little bit, but one of the distinction that's made between these alleged messiahs, two messiahs, is that one is going to be this conquering, victorious figure. This other one will die in battle and so forth. So the Messiah ben Joseph's the one that's going to die. The Messiah ben David's not going to die. And this allows them to say, okay, passages that talk about Messiah dying, Messiah ben Joseph, passages that talk about him as king and reigning and all that, Messiah ben David. Well, one huge problem with this is not that there's not this teaching that justifies thinking of a Messiah ben Joseph who will die, but it's the good old-fashioned Davidic Messiah who's spoken of as dying in many of these texts, right? So if you look for example, if you look at some rabbinic commentators, they will say that the figure in Zechariah 12:10 is Messiah ben Joseph when it talks about a figure being pierced, right? But here's something to think about as you read this. It says, I'll pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication, so that they'll look upon me whom they've pierced, and they'll mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. So Jewish groups will obviously emphasize the third person reference. They'll mourn for him, right? They'll ignore or try to do away with me whom they have pierced, and they'll emphasize that it's referring to someone at the latter part of the verse. But that's not our issue right now. The issue here is this a Davidic Messiah or a Messiah ben Joseph? Obviously, this is the one who died, so the rabbinic tradition in some cases identifies this figure as Messiah ben Joseph. They'll mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they'll weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. Now, here's what's puzzling, though, about this. What's the whole emphasis here on David? Right? The emphasis throughout this section is on David. Both what I read and what I didn't read. Going back to the beginning of this, verse 10, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. Not the house of Joseph, right? And the inhabitants of the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh or something like that. I'm going to pour out on David, the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and supplication, so that they'll look upon me whom they have pierced, and they'll mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they'll weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. In that day, watch this, there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land will mourn, every family by itself, the family of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Levi, and so forth, and the Shimeites. Now, there's more going on than I'm going to deal with, like always. I always say that. But the emphasis here is on the house of David, and it's not insignificant that it also mentions Nathan, Levi, and the house of Shimei. But what is this business in verse 11? In that day there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. Right? How many have any idea what that's all about? I mean, it's an event in biblical history, and it tells you how we should be familiar with biblical history, because these are clues laid in the text to help tip us off to what's going on. What this refers to is the death of Josiah, the king of Judah. Josiah, that godly king. Right here it's likening the death of this coming figure to the death of King Josiah. So you've got this emphasis on the house of David. God's going to pour out grace on the house of David, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, because of what they did in piercing this figure, and they're going to be mourning like Israel did at the death of that great king of Judah, Josiah. Right? Who's this figure who's going to be the cause of mourning for the house of David and so forth? They're going to see it and realize. Okay, so part of the point that I'm making here is this passage that's talking about Messiah suffering, accepted as messianic by all sorts of Jews, was consigned to the Ben Joseph category, because can't have Messiah Ben David dying. But all the indicators there, I think, are that this is a Davidic king, and there's other stuff to that. But this brings up then the question: why think of a Messiah Ben Joseph who's going to die? One of the things that's interesting, why is there such an emphasis on Joseph in the patriarchal narratives? When you go from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, you'd expect the focus to shift to Judah, because that's the one we expect the Messiah to come through. And isn't it explicitly said that the Messiah would? Genesis 49:10, Messiah will come through Judah. Yes, of course, but this still raises the puzzle. That's what raises the puzzle. Why is there not this emphasis on Judah but on Joseph? In Genesis 37 to 50, the focus is on Joseph. Why? Right? As you look at it, he's even being portrayed in a way that goes beyond other figures in many respects as the forerunner of Jesus. He's the great type of Jesus. He's like a type par excellence. You want to find a type of Jesus? Look at Joseph. His whole life is a big type of Jesus, and the various episodes are themselves like self-contained types of the gospel. He's clearly a very significant figure. Now, what is interesting, though, is to note that there's this strange interruption in the Joseph cycle. If you look at Genesis 38, it suddenly interrupts the Joseph story with a story about Judah and his relations with Tamar and so forth, that whole issue. Well, this again, I mean, it's curious stuff, right? So you've got this emphasis on Joseph, but suddenly Judah does pop up in this Joseph cycle. There's this whole little side thing about Judah, and I think there's a lot going on there that's relevant to how this all works out. But Joseph is is largely overlooked by Christians because there's such a strong emphasis on his Davidic descent and so forth. But something has to be said about the prominence of Joseph. It seems like he's being treated as Jacob's firstborn. Okay, remember several things. If you're going by the order of births, Reuben is the firstborn, and after him Simeon and Levi. But these are not children of his beloved wife, right? Rachel is his beloved wife. That's the one he wanted to marry. And Joseph was the son of that woman. But Jacob believed, I always have to stop because I get the names confused in my head. But Jacob believed his son was dead. And so naturally the affection that he had for Joseph would have transferred to Benjamin. He would have been his favored son in the absence of Joseph. But there's still this business of technically Reuben is the firstborn. But Reuben is disqualified because Reuben had relations with one of Jacob's concubines. So he loses his right as the firstborn. It therefore falls to Simeon and Levi in that order. But Simeon and Levi get disqualified at one fell swoop by what they did with the people of Shechem. Remember that whole sordid affair. So they get passed over. And that's why Judah becomes the recipient of the right of the firstborn. But you still have this issue that in the eyes of Jacob, it's the descendants of Rachel that are the all-important ones. And if he had his choice, it'd be Benjamin. Or better yet, Joseph, if he's actually alive, right? Well, anyways, when you look at Deuteronomy 33, it's evident that there's a greater emphasis placed on Joseph than every other figure in the blessing. Remember, this is, I'm sorry, hold on. What did I say? Deuteronomy 33. So here I'm talking about Moses. This is not Jacob, but Moses at the end of Deuteronomy 33, he's speaking over the tribes. So if you look at Deuteronomy 33, it has this preface where it's talking about what the Lord has done and how he gave the law and that sort of thing. And then it begins to talk about each of the tribes. First it mentions Reuben. Here's all it says about Reuben. May Reuben live and not die, nor his men be few. Right? What a great, grand blessing pronounced over Reuben. Now, I think it's a significant statement, but compared to what it says about others, that looks like he's being given short shrift. Of Judah, it says this regarding Judah: Hear, O Lord, the voice of Judah, bring him to his people. With his hands he contended for them. May you be a help against his adversaries. Okay, so it's a little bit longer than Reuben, but not much. Then it says of Levi, let your Thummim and your Urim belong to your godly man whom you proved at Massah, with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah, who said of his father and his mother, I did not consider them, and he did not acknowledge his brothers, nor did he regard his own sons. For they observed your word and kept your covenant. They shall teach your ordinances to Jacob and your law to Israel. They shall put incense before you and the whole burnt offerings on your altar. O Lord, bless his substance, accept the work of his hands, shatter the loins of those who rise up against him, and those who hate him, so that they will not rise again. Sounds like there's a much greater emphasis given here to Levi. Then you go to Benjamin, and it's again brief. May the beloved of the Lord dwell in security by him, with shields, or who shields him all day, and who he dwells between his shoulders. Now, I should say that length of words is not everything. Something really profound can be said in a short space. Here, Benjamin is called beloved of the Lord. I mean, that's as grand and glorious as I can think to be called. But it's still brief, right? But now you get to Joseph, and it's not only long, it's just fulsome in what it says with respect to the blessing on Joseph. Of Joseph he said, Blessed of the Lord be his land, with the choicest things of heaven, with the dew and from the deep lying beneath, and with the choicest yield of the sun, and with the choicest produce of the months, and with the best things of the ancient mountains, and with the choice things of the everlasting hills, and with the choice things of the earth in its fullness, and the favor of him who dwelt in the bush. Let it come to the head of Joseph, and to the crown of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers. As the firstborn of his ox, majesty is his. Notice, why is it calling him firstborn? Isn't Judah the one who gets the rights of firstborn? I mean, yes, but here it says the firstborn in connection with Joseph. As the firstborn of his ox, majesty is his, and his horns are the horns of the wild ox. With them he will push the peoples all at once to the ends of the earth. And those are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and those are the 10,000s of Manasseh. So here, and this is a point that Mitchell makes, there's two different words. He's called an ox here, Joseph, and there's two different words used for this, firstborn. It says, the firstborn of his ox, majesty is his, and his horns are the horns of the wild ox. So a wild ox is a kind of ox that, as I understand, is not around anymore, but it was a particularly ferocious beast, and it was not the sort of thing that would be tamed. It was a wild thing that you don't stand in this thing's way, kind of thing. But the other term for ox refers to a sacrificial animal. It's the kind of animal that would be sacrificed. And so he's called an ox twice over, but once the kind of ox that's a sacrificial victim, the other a ox that is not ruled but rules. It's an ox that's wild and so forth. And so part of what Mitchell is observing is Joseph is given great prominence. He seems to eclipse the other brothers, even Judah. He's given glorious promises that outstrip so many of them. The term firstborn is used for him. He's spoken of as an ox in both of these two ways. And so these, among other things, lead him to say that there's something to be said about the notion of a Messiah ben Joseph. The real issue is, how do you get there, right? And I've already said enough, and I'm leaving you all on a cliffhanger because it's good for you. Something to think through. How's that? Something to think through. Well, Bible Unbutchered says, please explain the Urim and Thummim. Well, obviously, this is a reference to Joseph Smith's seer stones, right? I'm jesting, of course. For those that don't know, Joseph Smith, the false prophet that started the Mormon cult, he claimed that he had access to the ancient Urim and Thummim and was able to decipher the plates that he had found. Well, honestly, I can't really say much. I don't know that there is a clear understanding out there of exactly I mean what this involved, but it was a way by which the priest could get a decision from the Lord. And the way it's described is somewhat like our flipping a coin. It's a way, well, that's a little bit misspeak. I mean, when they cast lots, that's more like flipping a coin. But in some way, it's similar to that sort of thing, but with the proviso that, of course, the Lord determines its every decision. So it's not like, just some arbitrary thing. But we don't really know exactly what they looked like or how they, what exactly was the process or anything like that. but it was a way, one of the ways by which the priests could determine the Lord's will. All right. Nate says, appreciate the long response. Yeah, so I would recommend, if you're interested in getting into it, David Mitchell's book, Messiah ben Joseph. That doesn't mean I agree with everything he says, so don't misunderstand that. All right. Well, I've been here 3.5 hours. I just realized it's 12:30. I preach in the morning, so I'm going to call it quits for tonight, but I do appreciate you all. It's a joy always to teach people, speak of Christ. So I thank you. Thank you for being here. Pray the Lord will bless you, that you'll have a blessed Lord's Day tomorrow. And I'll see you again, Lord willing. God bless.